Imagine this. It's before 1964, and in many parts of America, a black child and a white child can't legally drink from the same water fountain. A black family could drive for hundreds of miles, and not a single hotel would give them a room or a restaurant serve them a meal. This wasn't just a matter of prejudice, it was the law. But one movement rose up and shattered that status quo. This is the story of how the struggle for civil rights didn't just change laws, it changed America forever. To really get the impact of the civil rights movement, you have to understand the world it replaced, a world built on a legal fiction. Back in 1896, the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson gave a green light to racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. But here's the thing. Separate was never, ever equal. This system, known as Jim Crow, was a tangled web of laws designed to hold down and disenfranchise African Americans, especially in the South. It controlled every part of life. Schools for black children were chronically underfunded, often just run-down shacks with old second-hand books. Public transportation was a daily humiliation. Black passengers had to pay at the front, get off the bus, and re-enter through the back door to sit in a separate section. And if the white section filled up, they could be forced to give up their seat. Economic opportunities were just as divided. The best jobs were saved for whites, leaving African Americans with mostly low-wage labor, no matter their education or skills. Racist housing policies made owning a home a nearly impossible dream. And the most basic right in a democracy, the right to vote, was brutally suppressed. Poll taxes required a fee to vote, which was a huge barrier for poor families. So-called literacy tests were designed for failure, with white registrars demanding black applicants interpret complex legal jargon that they themselves couldn't understand. And holding this whole rotten system together was the constant, terrifying threat of violence. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups used terror and lynching to enforce the racial order, often with the complicity of an all-white justice system. For millions of Americans, this wasn't ancient history. This was daily life. It was a nation fractured by design, and breaking it would take an unimaginable force of courage. The first cracks in the wall of Jim Crow weren't made by marches but by legal briefs. For decades, a brilliant team of NAACP lawyers had been playing the long game in the nation's courtrooms. Their lead strategist was Thurgood Marshall, a man who would one day become a Supreme Court justice, but who first made his name by tearing down the very system he was forced to live under. The NAACP's strategy was genius. They didn't attack segregation all at once. They chipped away at it, starting with higher education, winning cases that forced universities to admit black students by arguing that no separate grad school could possibly be equal. This legal campaign finally hit its peak in 1954 with a case that would change everything. Brown vs. Board of Education. The face of the case became a little girl named Linda Brown, who had to travel miles to her under-resourced all-black school, even though a modern, well-funded all-white school was just a short walk from her home. Before the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall argued that segregation wasn't just about unequal schools, it was about stamping black children with a badge of inferiority, a psychological wound that could never be healed. On May 17, 1954, the court agreed. In a unanimous decision, they declared that in public education, separate is inherently unequal. Legally, Jim Crow was on life support, but the fight was far from over. The South erupted in what they called massive resistance. The most dramatic showdown came in 1957, when the governor of Arkansas used the National Guard to block 9 black teenagers from entering Little Rock Central High School. These students, the Little Rock Nine, faced down screaming mobs, their path cleared only when President Eisenhower sent in federal troops to enforce the law. Brown was a massive victory, but Little Rock proved a court order couldn't change a society on its own. The law had changed, but hearts and minds hadn't. The battle had to move from the courtroom to the streets. On December 1, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a bus after a long day. When the driver told her to give up her seat for a white man, she said no. Her quiet act of defiance was the spark that lit a fire. Parks was a seasoned activist, and local leaders knew this was the moment. They organized a bus boycott that lasted for 381 days. The entire black community of Montgomery walked, carpooled, and organized their own taxi systems, all while facing constant harassment and threats. The boycott introduced the world to a young, charismatic pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose blend of Christian faith and Gandhian nonviolence gave the movement its soul. The boycott didn't end until the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional. Montgomery proved that ordinary people, when united, could change the course of history. The strategy of nonviolent protest started to spread. On February 1, 1960, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter and asked to be served. When they were refused, they just sat there, quietly reading. The next day, more students joined them. Soon, hundreds were participating. These sit-ins were powerful. They were simple, direct, and on the nightly news, they showed the whole country the ugly face of segregation, peaceful, well-dressed students being heckled, assaulted, and dragged away by police. The tactics spread like wildfire, desegregating lunch counters and other public places across the South. Then, in 1961, activists organized the Freedom Rides. Integrated groups of black and white volunteers rode buses into the Deep South to challenge segregation in interstate travel. What they met was horrifying. In Alabama, one bus was firebombed. In Birmingham, a mob brutally beat riders with bats and pipes. The violence was so shocking it made international headlines, deeply embarrassing the Kennedy administration during the Cold War. Under pressure, the federal government was finally forced to step in and enforce desegregation on buses and in terminals. The Freedom Rides proved a core lesson. Sometimes you have to force a crisis to get the government to act. By 1963, the movement was at a boiling point. Dr. King and the SCLC launched a major campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, known then as the most segregated city in America. The city's police commissioner, Bull Connor, vowed to crush the protests. As the city's jails filled up with adult marchers, the movement made a risky choice. They let children and teenagers march. What happened next? America couldn't look away from. Bull Connor unleashed police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses on the young protesters. The images were sickening. Children slammed against walls by jets of water, attacked by snarling dogs. Broadcast into living rooms across the country, this brutal reality created a groundswell of support for federal civil rights legislation. Riding this momentum, leaders organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people, black and white, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. It was a peaceful, powerful call for change. The day was filled with famous speeches, but it was the last speaker who made history. Standing in the shadow of Lincoln, Dr. King started with his prepared notes. But then, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He pushed his notes aside and began to preach. He spoke of a nation that had given its black citizens a bad check that had come back marked insufficient funds. But he refused to believe the Bank of Justice was bankrupt. Then, his voice soaring, he painted a picture of a new America. "I have a dream," he thundered, "that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." In that moment, the moral purpose of the movement was crystallized for the entire world to see. That dream became the dream of a nation. The moral power of Birmingham and the March on Washington was unstoppable. President John F. Kennedy proposed a sweeping civil rights bill. After his assassination, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, made passing that bill his mission, putting his legendary political muscle behind it. After overcoming a massive filibuster by Southern senators, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. It was revolutionary. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It banned segregation in all public places, hotels, restaurants, theaters. The whites-only sign was now officially illegal. The law was a dagger in the heart of Jim Crow. But one major piece of the system was still in place, the denial of the right to vote. So, in 1965, the movement focused its energy on Selma, Alabama, where only 2% of eligible black citizens were registered to vote. The campaign planned a march from Selma to the capital, Montgomery. On March 7, 1965, as 600 peaceful marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by a wall of state troopers who charged, firing tear gas and beating them with clubs. The cameras captured it all. The nation was horrified by what it saw on Bloody Sunday. 8 days later, President Johnson addressed Congress. "Their cause must be our cause too," he declared. Then, in a stunning moment, the Southern president adopted the movement's anthem as his own, proclaiming, "And we shall overcome." That August, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It banned literacy tests and gave the federal government the power to oversee elections in states with a history of discrimination. The effect was immediate. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands of new black voters were registered across the South. For the first time in nearly a century, African Americans became a true political force. Together, these two laws finally dismantled the legal structure of American apartheid. But the civil rights movement did more than just change laws. It changed how America saw itself. A new sense of identity and pride took root, summed up in 4 powerful words: Black is beautiful. It was a radical act of self-love, a rejection of white beauty standards, and a celebration of black culture. You could feel this new consciousness everywhere. It pulsed through poetry and literature, but most of all, you could hear it in the music. The freedom songs, adapted from old spirituals, were the movement's literal soundtrack. At the same time, soul music exploded into the mainstream. Artists like James Brown, with his anthem "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," created a sound that was unapologetically black and impossible to ignore. The movement forced a national conversation about race and justice that continues to this day. It pushed black history out of the shadows and into schools. It pressured Hollywood and TV to move beyond racist caricatures and show real black faces and stories. The movement didn't just demand a seat at the table. It forced the nation to build a bigger, more honest table for everyone. The civil rights movement was America's second revolution. It toppled a century-old system of legal segregation and secured laws that changed the country. The strategies of nonviolent protest and grassroots organizing became a blueprint for change that has been used by movements for social justice ever since, from disability rights to women's rights and LGBTQ+ rights. But the work isn't over. Key parts of the Voting Rights Act have been weakened in recent years. Inequality in our economy, our neighborhoods, and our justice system is still very real. The fight for that more perfect union continues. The greatest tribute we can pay to the heroes who marched and bled for freedom is to pick up the torch and continue the work, pushing ever forward to fully realize that dream of a nation where every single person is judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. If this history was meaningful to you, subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments, what part of the civil rights movement's legacy do you think is most important today?